Three, two, and we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Global Citizens. My name is Calvin. I am the show's host, and of course, I'm also its creator. So, this is actually the last episode for 2020, and I really want to start next year strongly. And I think there's no other way to do it for our TCK community and the Global Citizens community in general than to invite the person whom people regard as the modern mother of this community, the modern mother of the third culture kids. So my guest for today is none other than Dr. Ruth Van Reken. So if you have been involved in the TCK community for a certain duration of time, this amazing lady needs zero introduction. She is both the founder of FIGT, Families in Global Transition. Oh, my apologies, co-founding members, and she is also the co-author of what we call the Bible, the Third Culture Kids Growing Up Among Worlds. So for today, we will be hearing her insights, her opinions, and of course, for all of her experiences. So yeah, Ruth, I know that since this show is also dedicated for the future generations of TCK, maybe they are just introduced to this lifestyle for the very first time. If you don't mind, please share with us about how everything started for you.
Thanks, Calvin. I'm so glad to be here, and I love it that you are carrying it on for the next generation. I may be the modern mother, but I'm not the mother. As you know, Ruth Hussein and her husband went to India in the 1950s, and they went to study how people from one culture would do business with another. And before third culture was applied to the children, they were talking about people from two cultures that formed a space in between where it wasn't like the first culture or the second culture, the home or the host culture, but it was a way of life that they formed as they came together and their cultures met. And as Dr. Useems were in India, they noticed that the children of those who came at the time they were studying from the States, but it expanded as they were working there. People who came because of a career were working in this place, but their children were different in characteristics in several ways than the kids they had taught in their university at home. So that's why they called them the third culture kid. And then, of course, Dave Pollock went to Kenya in the 70s, and he worked with third culture kids in a school there. And he was the one who developed the profile, which is in our book, where the common characteristics that he noticed. So I'm building on people before me. Norma McCabe also started Global Nomads. She didn't like to be called a kid. So she said Global Nomads, which has become almost a word that people use very differently now. But that's how it started. And so I was in Liberia working there, and I got an invitation to send in some survey for my children for a conference that was going to be in the Philippines. And right at that time, I had started journaling. I was 39. And I was trying to figure out, I had this wonderful life, but there was a part of my life that I had felt depression and something that I could never put my name on. Maybe some of you have felt that, that for all the wonderfulness of your life, there's still this place that doesn't feel quite settled or something. So I started journaling. And when I got this invitation for this conference to send in for my children, I wrote them back, and Dave Pollock was organizing it. And I said, what are you doing for the adults? Because I'm 39 and nobody ever had reentry seminars or anything you're talking about. So that's how it started for me, that I went to that conference, and then eventually that journaling that I was doing became my first book, which is Letters Never Sent. And then I told Dave Pollock I'd help him, and the rest is history, as they say, to write up his material. But it's been an incredibly interesting life for me, and I couldn't have asked for a richer life or a fuller life than I've had, meeting people all over the world who've grown up like I did when I thought I was the only one who was kind of weird when I grew up. So that's how it started.
Thank you so much for saying that. Yeah, I discovered the term TCK around 2 years ago. At that time, yeah, sad to say, I was actually drunk. Yeah, I was at a party at that time.
Probably drunk and
Yeah.
you're trying to forget your story. But,
Well, the thing is this. At that time, I actually grew up in Singapore for almost 20 years of my life. So
okay.
growing up in Indonesia, a developing country, and then afterwards, when you are in Singapore, people always have this stereotype expecting you to be a rich kid who is over pampered, like you can't do anything. And when the thing is that I've always been an independent young man. I've always been independent since I was young. So I've started working since I was around 17. So when people give me that unfair kind of perception, it's not something that I can willingly accept.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I always had issue with in trying to ingratiate myself in whereby the community is only made out of locals. And the thing is Singapore itself is a melting pot of multiple cultures. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
in Singapore, there's a monument that actually recognizes the Chinese, Malay, Indian, and the Eurasian as part of their
Wow.
community. And yet, I don't feel a sense of belonging. I mean, I love the country. At the same time, being an Indonesian Chinese, I mean, I'm born here, but the thing is that there's a certain difficulty to relate.
Mm-hmm.
So when I found the term was actually through a buddy of mine when we were at an event, and of course at the time, as I mentioned, honestly, I was drunk.
That's okay.
So yeah,
Maybe
so
it
at the
helps you understand it better.
actually, at the time, I was thinking, oh, okay, there's a term called TCK. Cool. Then the next day, then I actually, surprisingly, I remember that. I remember that
Good
term
for
so
you.
vividly. Then afterwards, when I actually head back to Indonesia, then I started to experience the cultural differences. What is the main area? What is the difficulty that I encountered? Because I grew up in a place whereby efficiency and standard has already been put in place. And then this country, which is supposed to be my hometown, is
Mm-hmm.
my home country is not adapting to the system. Instead, they want me to, in a sense, lower down my standard to actually accommodate them. So this became a gigantic source of depression for me, like what you have
Mm-hmm.
mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, well, in the past, I actually journal it by writing articles.
Okay.
And actually, a friend of mine who is an expat, he had worked with TCK a lot, and he actually told me, but you don't represent the point of view of the different cross-cultural kids. What about the parachute babies? What about missionary kids and the military brats? And well, from that point on, I actually turned the format into this kind of live live chat whereby people actually can hear the your own story, your own
Mm-hmm.
perspective. So that's how actually this thing started. So yeah, I do relate to what you said.
Well, I think
And
what you're doing is really important because I think for most of us, we grew up thinking, what's the matter with me? When we didn't fit in here and we didn't fit in there. And the people around us kind of thought, what's the matter with them? That they don't look like there's. Well, when I went back to the States and I was 13, after I grew up in Nigeria, I forgot to say that. I did grow up in Nigeria. And then I went back to the States at 13. And of course, I looked like the other kids in my school. It was pre integration days. And I spoke like them, but I didn't think like them. And so I had always thought people liked me and that I fit in. And all of a sudden, like you said, I didn't fit in. I didn't know the culture. I took it personally that it was something that was deficient in me. And of course, I knew the kids were talking about me behind my back because I didn't have the right clothes. And when you're 13, it's a terrible time anyway. But I think that's a common experience, but we didn't know it when we were doing it.
I think even until now, at 27, and I think as we grow older, we actually realize that the more we know stuff, there's actually the more that we don't know about it.
That's right. That's
Though
right.
at
I was very
13,
smart at 20. At
yeah.
75, I'm much less smart, but I've learned a lot.
Well, the older you are, you learn more.
You
So
learn more.
hey,
It's all
all
right.
right, all right. Ruth, so my question now is this actually though. Is it fair to say that instead of ruthlessness, the term third culture kid be used as a point of view from someone who sees the world from an observer or a third person point of view, because this is actually how I see the term. Because when I actually first started reading your book,
Okay.
the thing is that at one point I actually doubt, am I considered a TCK then? Then because I don't fit in with the traditional format, because my parents are I'm not a business brat, I'm not a military kid, I'm not a
Mhm.
missionary kid, and the thing is that my experience as a TCK actually is from three sub areas of the CCK itself, which is I'm the child of a domestic TCK. I'm an educational TCK because I went to an international school in my home country, and I actually became a hybrid TCK because I actually went to study alone in a country outside of my own home country at a really young age without my parents being there. So yeah, let me
I
pass you
think
back.
yeah, what you're bringing up. First, let me just comment on your comments because after I started working with the official TCK, which was mostly the kids of people who'd gone overseas because of a career, so many people came up to me exactly like you just said. They said, I'm relating to the profile, I'm relating to the experience, I'm relating to everything you talked about, but I didn't do it your way. Am I a TCK or not? At that time, in the TCK community, there was all this discussion who was and who wasn't. And people were being quite protective for the term, it has to stay pure. And other people were saying everybody can be in. We were losing the discussion of the topic because we were fighting about the term. And so there was a day I finally thought, I've got to find a way to look at a bigger picture because I know there's a bigger picture here. And we have to be able to see what is going on in the world in some other way. So I made, for some conference I was going to, I made the term cross-cultural kid, and I tried to make a bigger umbrella. And the thing that was interesting, I put in there, okay, so traditional TCK, which would be the people I'd been working with, and then as some of the ones you mentioned, educational CCK, somebody who goes to school in a different culture. Every day they're switching cultures from home and school. It can be domestic TCK, somebody who grows up in different cultures in their own country, or refugees and immigrants and people who are from binational parents, where they go between grandmas and they switch. Anyway, there's all kinds of ways it's happening in the world. And the thing that was interesting, exactly what you just said, Calvin, that I thought, okay, there's these different ways. Well, the first time I used that in a talk just to see if it worked and if people related to it, this lady came up and she said, can you be in more than one circle? I thought, oh, okay, what do you mean? And she said, well, I'm from India. I'm married to, my husband is from a different language and cultural group from India. And then we immigrated to the States. And my kids went to school, of course, like, in a different culture. We're a minority, so we're in a different relationship to the majority culture. Then we got a job in an international company and we went overseas, all these things. And I thought, wow, the story is getting really complex. When I was a child, I lived in Nigeria. I went back to America. I went from America back to Nigeria. And so I had two countries. I had sort of two home bases. My father had been born and raised in what is now Iran. So I had that third culture piece in there, but I didn't know it then. So what you're saying, Calvin, is the whole point we have to look at. Now, some of the people like Danao Tanu are saying if you go all the way back to what the third culture was in the first place, which is people negotiating different cultural worlds, she said, really, that's what all of your cross-cultural kid groups are doing. So I think that's part of the discussion right now. How do we define, how do we form it? But I think what you're asking me about the rootlessness, this is one thing I want to say. We talk about rootlessness, but I think maybe there are different ways to find roots. That's one thing. I think I feel at home in many places now. But one of the things I also want to say, absolutely, it's an observer in one sense, but in another way, there is something happening in the world that never happened before, where there's this kind of cultural mixing and matching all over the world. It's causing a lot of confusion, but we who've lived it are not just spectators in the stands watching it. We're actually in the game. we're on the field playing it. And so it's up to us also to try and understand it, try and understand our personal stories, and then try and give some kind of language and meaning and understanding as the whole world is globalizing in a way that it never did before. Otherwise, we're just going to have a mess. So, well, we have a mess. We got to try and help sort out the mess, I think. But so when you ask if we're observing, I guess what I would like to say is we're in that position. Yes, we can observe it because we've seen it, but we're really in the game and we need to understand it. We're not just on the fringe. We're in the middle. And to me, I think that's very exciting.
Okay. I'm glad you mentioned the term that we are on the field. So, yeah, typically whenever I start doing this, a guest of mine, maybe in the backstage, they will ask something like, is the questions going to be hard, man? Or is the questions going to be hard, Calvin? So I'm saying, no, don't worry. But I'm so sorry for your case, though. Your question is the standard bearer of difficulty for a TCK guest.
Your
The
questions have been wonderful. I loved receiving them, and let's see where they go today.
Thank you, thank you.
You have a good
Yeah,
mind.
so to piggyback off what you said on being on the field, yeah. Earlier we mentioned on the difference between this globalization era and how it was compared to in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually to come up with your question, it came to the point that I actually have an idea for two different articles.
Okay.
So yeah,
Tell me about them.
one of the idea is called the 3G generation. So I always feel that with globalization, it has create there's three factors in this particular word. So first one is globalization, access to gadgetry, and it created a generational differences. I think in terms of the gadgetry, we can see in this COVID era, the thing is that a lot of system has to be changed, and in terms of education, how it is executed, it has to be changed. So countries that are a lot more developed, they have easy access to technology. So to them, e-learning is something that is easily accessible. But for developing countries, especially those which has a impoverished economy, that is not something that is easily accessible. Now, within the difference between the millennial generation and of course the with TCK is
Older,
that
but
sorry,
you can call us the older generation.
let's
So,
call it the all right.
no,
Let's
whatever.
call it okay.
Yeah,
Said it herself, guys. I'm innocent on this.
no, that's okay. We'll just call us the older generation right now.
Let's call it the mature generation,
There
if
we
you want
go.
to call it.
That's good. That's
Or
good.
you want to call it, you can call it the vino, the wine. I mean, the older it is, the better it is.
Okay. There you go.
Yeah. The thing is that for a millennial, for them is they are able to see what globalization is.
Mm-hmm.
It's because they experience the different cultures. They see the
Mm-hmm.
different cultures on any media platform, and if they find it fascinating, so as a result, they adapt that mindset. For a third culture kid, though, we live in the
Mm-hmm.
different generation. To us, there are a lot of time where we have to change how we look, how we talk, because
Mm-hmm.
we want to fit in.
Mm-hmm.
So with regards to this though, uh, what do you think that is TCK make what part of TCK would be make them to be a suitable leader for the upcoming generation for this?
I think you raise wonderful questions, Calvin. I love your mind very much and how you think, and that gives me great hope for your generation that you
Thank you.
guys are thinking, and that's important. I think when you ask about leadership, there's a couple things. No one is automatically a leader because there are different personalities in any background in any place. And so just having a certain experience doesn't automatically make you a leader. But I think the experience can make you certainly have understanding. And then for those who are with leadership capacity, that it can really give a new approach to some of the questions that we have. that are facing our world. And so I do believe the first conference I ever went to in 1984, Dr. Ted Ward was speaking. He was a sociologist at Michigan State, and he said third culture kids were the prototype citizen of the future. I thought, well, that's kind of arrogant, because I thought he was saying that, we're so special that everybody should be like us. But what he was saying was the experience of growing up among many cultures with mobility is going to be the norm one day, and that is the norm. And even for people, I live in Indianapolis, which when I moved here 30 some years ago, everybody was from here. Now we have countless people. We have international stores. We have people speaking all kinds of languages because the world has come to us. And so I think that that's becoming normal. But for those of us who've lived in many places and really experienced in a conscious way what it is to be cross-cultural and multicultural and all these things, we do have insights that can help give some solutions, that can give some understanding. Because I think the biggest thing about this TCK community for me is it actually proves that past and beyond different cultures and different races and stuff, there's a humanness in us that every person that's ever born wants to be in relationship. Every person who's ever born wants to belong. Every person who's ever born feels it when there's separation comes or when there's joy. And we're creative, and we all want to have a sense of significance. Those are the core things that we want as humans that transcend the differences in our experience. But then after we look at those and we see how culture is part of how we meet our needs, and then we have our personalities, I think that we have this incredible opportunity to understand first our own story, because if I understand my story, then I can look through that lens for years. But the one thing that I have seen that gives me caution with TCKs is that as we've come to understand our story, sometimes we think that makes us different than everybody else. So I appreciate that you're bringing in these other situations, because Janet Bennett, who is a cross-cultural, intercultural, guru, talks about when we have these experiences with culture, we can have a healthy kind of cultural marginality, which gives us what you're saying, that you can see the different cultures at the same time and how they work. But sometimes, she said, people who raise this way wind up with a sense of terminal uniqueness. I'm so different that nobody else can understand me. Well, none of us want that disease. What we want to understand is we've had this powerful experience that shaped our lives enormously. And it's given us this vision you're talking about, so we can see other things and start to become part of a conversation for healing and for helping other people understand what's going on to them also in these days where everything feels confused for some people. So I do believe that we have a position and a gifting, and we want to use it bigger than just looking for ourselves, but we start with ourselves so we can understand what we're talking about.
All right.
Make sense?
Makes perfect sense.
Okay.
Yeah. One of the idea I already have, one of your question that I had in mind is what Dr. Ward said. It's that TCK is the template of the humans of the future. Yeah. So, but before that though, so my next question is how do you feel that a monoculture could approach a global citizens? And here's the thing: a lot of us, when we heard this dreaded question, so where are you from? Where is home to you? That is an ultimate nightmare to
Yeah.
us. A lot of my guests will always say home is with family or with their loved ones, right? So the thing is that at the end of the day, though, we always want to feel a sense of belonging. I mean, some of us, maybe when our younger days, we could enter a certain type of clique just simply because we want to belong, even though we don't feel that we fit in, but we just want to feel that kind of belonging, though. So how do you feel, though, those who have never lived this lifestyle, how do you think that they could be a lot more sensitive in approaching a TCK, a CCK, or any of those who has experienced this multicultural life?
Part of it is education, um, helping, stories like this, movies. There's so many movies now that are about CCKs of some sort. The Crazy Rich Asians is a classic. There's so many that really tell the story. But I think the first thing is, whose responsibility is it to make that bridge? Because none of us can understand what we don't know until at least we're taught. So I think as we understand our story, we understand how it might be different than theirs. And I think number one, the first question is, how do we find our own sense of belonging? That's one of the things that what you're doing right now is so helpful. There is a place I do belong, and it's in a community of people who understand my story. I had moved back to Indianapolis, and I thought I was trying to fit in as a suburban housewife. And I was talking to somebody one day, and she said something, and whatever I said in response, it's, well, when I lived in Africa and I said this and that, and I was 55 at the time. And she looked at me and she said, that's why people say you're so arrogant, because you think you know everything because you've lived everywhere. And I just started to cry. And I thought, man, I'm never going to fit in. I'm 55. I'm trying my best. I've got kids in school. And so I said to her, the problem is if I try to pretend like I'm a suburban housewife, then I have a place. But as soon as I tell you who I am, I don't have a place. And that felt so lonely. But shortly after that, we went to Kenya for a year. My husband was working with IU Medical School, and they had a program over there. And the first night we were there, people were sitting there and talking about what they were doing. And one of them had been at Antarctica doing something with the penguins, I think. And somebody else was out, and, everybody had been doing something crazy. And I thought, if you were at my table in Indiana, this would sound like either you're bragging or it's crazy. But actually, it's very normal. This is what this world does. People do these crazy things, but they're not crazy. They're normal. And I think in that moment, I thought, okay, there's a world I understand, I fit in. And I can't demand that other people understand it because I really don't understand theirs. I don't know what it is to grow up on a farm in Iowa. I don't know what it is to grow up in a village, in Nigeria. So I think the biggest thing is we have to listen to each other's stories. And I don't have to feel intimidated. When you say, where am I from? I can figure out an answer for that. When people ask me now, I say, I live in Indianapolis. They never ask me, they don't even know I didn't answer their question. Because people are asking that in a traditional way. That's how you make a connection. Because if I say I'm from the same place, oh, well, do you know so-and-so and such and such? For us, we get scared by it because it feels like I can't answer and I feel deficient. But once I stop feeling deficient, I don't care if you ask me the question. I can either say, well, I was born in Nigeria and I grew up in different places, or I can just say I live in Indianapolis, or I can say I can make up something that I want. So anyway, so I think the biggest thing for me in that question is not asking them to understand, but understanding within myself that I do belong. I have places of belonging, and nobody belongs everywhere. But then I want to hear their story too. We're not always very good about asking somebody else's story because we think ours is so special. Ours is special, but so is theirs. They have things to teach us too. So I don't know if that answers your question, but for me, it starts inside me. And after that, we can have a great time talking, and I can learn a lot.
Yeah, that's actually really beautiful. Yeah, I love it. I love it. Now the thing is yeah, it is true. I think it's because when we are too stuck with what we have always had, we forgot what is around us
That's
and
right.
what we could actually learn from there.
That's right.
Yeah,
I think there's so much, that person has a story. One of the things for us to understand as a community, the people that first identified us weren't TCKs because they were outside looking and they could notice what's different. And we're inside and we think, we don't even know it's different because how could we know it's different except they had grown up more monoculturally. So I think that one of the things that we forget that there's a lot we can learn. I've learned a lot from my friends who are from one place, and they're the ones who believe in long-term friendships, and they call me every couple of weeks to see if I'm okay. And I think there's something about stability. that I can learn from. And so, that's why I don't want to be terminally unique. I want to be a person who had this experience, who was shaped by it, who grew by it, who loves it, who finds it terribly interesting. But it's interesting because it's a human story, and other people and their human stories are also interesting to me. And so I think the world's an interesting place.
Indeed. Okay, to carry on from your point on that, on how we need to be a lot more aware of where we are at instead of our background. Yeah.
Mhm.
So this is actually a second article that I will be making for 2021. This is actually from one of my contacts that actually highlighted that growing up maturity in the eastern part of the world, like in Asia, for example,
Mhm.
is based on how well do you listen to your parents' instruction. Whereas in comparison, in the West, it's how much you can make your own decision based on
Okay.
your own
Mhm.
independence. So my question on this is that how do you think that TCK can reclaim their root, like for at least in a sense you can call it their parents' root, to
Mhm.
fully comprehend it? I mean, there's no way to fully understand it, but truly embrace it within themselves. Because the thing is that they are formed by multiple cultures. For my
Mhm.
case, I grew up in a second culture, but even then,
Mhm.
there's multiple subcultures in it. I
Right.
mean, my college is affiliated with an Irish university. My
Mm.
aunt, who I consider my second mom, is married to a Korean. My cousin, who is her son, is half Korean, half Indonesian, who grew up in Singapore, Indonesia, and South Korea now, to the point that he himself is experiencing a lot of cultural issues.
That's right.
So, how do you think, though, while moving forward, we can never fully grasp a certain culture and concept completely, but how do you think, though, it can make the process a lot easier to do that?
I think we've just entered in the last year or two a new phase of understanding about TCKs. Um, just like I built on the work of the people before me, your generation has to build on what I would consider to be the foundations. I think my book is not a Bible because the Bible, I don't think, changes. And this topic keeps growing. So maybe we have progressive revelation here or something. But what I am really enjoying right now, I felt like, a year or two ago that, okay, I've said what I have to say, and here we are. In our last edition, where Dave Pollock, who died in 2004, his son joined. So that is where it's been evolving. But in that edition, we tried to bring in as many news stories as we could because people kept saying to me, it's a very Western book, it's very white, it's very, whatever. And all I can say is I did my best, but I can only write from what I know. And so a few years ago, 10 years ago, I think Danao Tanu met me in Singapore. And by the way, even in Singapore, that mix of cultures, it still becomes its own culture in its own way, you
Yep.
know. So that's another story. But anyway, Danao flew, she was working on her PhD on the Asian TCKs. And she flew from Australia to meet me in Singapore. And she said to me then, she said that, you talk about your profile and that TCKs are so globally aware and all that stuff. She said, I don't think that's really true as you think, because I went to an international school and she said it was very Western. And so I had to be Western in the day. But the minute I came home at night, of course, I had to switch my cultural world and become Asian. And she said, at school, I learned to ask questions. At home, that wasn't so good. And she said, so I don't think, she said, nobody at school knew who I really was when I went home. Well, that was like a whole new revelation to me. And that's why I like what I do. I keep learning. And so Danao has become a real leader, I think, in the field. And she and Isabel Min, who Isabel tried a few years ago, she came to Families in Global Transition almost as the only Asian She went back to Korea and tried to start TCKs in Korea, and it was kind of people didn't understand yet. But Isabel also taught me much about the differences. So the two of them have started, as you know, TCKs of Asia,
Yeah.
and they've had some great forums. And as I've listened to them, I realized I think there is this whole next level. So we're really at TCK2 now, where these questions that you're answering, I think one of their podcasts, you can look at it, people can watch yours too, but they do have that. One of them was a foreigner in my own family. That was one of their last ones, where exactly what you're saying, the parents would like the kids to learn English and they send them to international schools, but they don't want them to become Western. And suddenly within the family, this is different than my experience because I went to school in English. My parents were both from the States. We just went back and forth. I didn't have that cultural clash at home. So what I'm learning between language and the parental things, this is a problem. But I think what I am watching happen on the TCKs of Asia, and I'm sure on your podcast too, Calvin,
Yep.
as people share their stories and it normalizes them, then you can figure out what to do with it. But what happens is when the parents, and we can educate the parents too, the parents are mad because they think, well, if you're Korean or Indonesian or Singaporean or whatever, you should be this way because I am. And my own mother, who's American, and I said I had much less, issue like than you might have, said to me once, she said, until you started doing this crazy stuff, I thought you were from Chicago. And I said, well, why would I be from Chicago? And she said, because I am. I said, but Mom, I grew up in Nigeria. So, this difference, even as small a difference generationally as we had culturally, for today's kids who are not from Western cultures and who have language and all that, your degree of sorting out has become exponential to me. The cultural complexity that you're dealing with is huge. But I do believe, as I'm watching people from these backgrounds talk and share, and each person, somebody says something and the next person says, oh, and they add to it, then we start to understand the story. And when we start to put language and understand the story, we can make choices about what we do with it. We can make choices to educate our parents. We can make choices maybe even for different things. Maybe every parent doesn't want to send their kid away anymore to an international school because they're starting to learn that it changes things they didn't realize. But that's going to be your generation's job.
Yeah, I actually was laughing at that is because I had the same kind of conversation with my father. My dad always expected me to follow a typical Chinese Indonesian son. Is that, oh, you have a business, we have a business, you're going to take over the business, something along that line. And when I offered a different kind of solution, is that, well, it's a little, because the way I approach it is a lot more pragmatic because my dad can be a bit too emotional at times. So when he said, why can't you get through my mindset? This is how it's supposed to be done in Indonesia. I'm like, yeah, but I don't grow up here in Indonesia. And with all due respect, what I'm doing is making it faster. Why are you trying to beat around an extra bush when directly we can do it? And we actually had an argument on that. It's because he doesn't understand at that time, especially in my first year in back home, he doesn't understand what is this differing mindset. To him, this is how
Right.
it's supposed to be done. This is how I know how to do things. And he already keep insisting, like my nephew, his grandson, you all are not going to go overseas on your own anymore, yada yada, something along that line.
Yep.
And I'm like, you realize that the world is becoming more global. You can't
Right.
keep insisting how your way of doing things.
Right.
So
So we have to have kindness toward our parents too, because when they grew up, they followed the rules. They grew up in a place and culture was pretty set and they followed the rules. And that's how it's supposed to be. If you see Fiddler on the Roof, he said it's a shake his as a fiddler on the roof because his kids aren't doing it right. So we have to be kind towards our parents. I think also one of the things we say, we are so cross-cultural, but maybe when we go back to our home countries, quote unquote, or our passport countries, we are more impatient because we've seen things differently, whatever way it is. And so we're not kind to our own people, and we're not kind to our own culture. So maybe part of our wisdom is to say, okay, I know I changed. Um, I know there's a way that I think could be more efficient. How do we move that in a way that is acceptable without, because what we want to do, at least what I want to do, is I want to come and say, look, so obvious, so obvious. But culture is always obvious to the person, but not to somebody from a different culture, because we have a lens we're looking. We have to understand, Calvin, that we see the world through a certain lens. It's a global lens. What you're
Yep.
saying before, we're observing it that way. Other people don't have that same lens. And so sometimes we think our lens is so much better, it's so much richer. Well, they're not so sure because they kind of like how it was. And it was comfortable, they belong. We talk about belonging. They say, well, I belong. I know where I belong. It's very clear to them. And so when we come with our new ideas or globalization or whatever, it makes people nervous. And I think that's part of the confusion in the world right now. People are getting very nervous about losing me, losing us. We've always been us and them. Now them wants to become us and us wants to become them, and we don't know who anybody is. So people are starting to try and retrench. So part of our job is to say we can understand why it's hard. We ourselves personally had to figure these things out or are figuring them out. Who am I among the many? But also it's important, Calvin, that we know who we are no matter where we are. And I think having some values that I hold and some principles and faith and different things that carry me through in a steady way when the cultures around are changing is another part of developing a strength. And so you can go back and maybe one of your values is to respect your parents, especially from that culture. So how do you do that in a way when you have differences? Is there another way to do that? Sometimes, that should be a skill set we have. We may not be as fully developed as we think we are, but how can you still show them respect, but in a different way? Maybe that's part of this secret.
One way for me that has worked is actually I will keep my I will learn the values, I will
Mhm.
learn the tradition, and I will embrace it as much as I can. But the way I operate it, I will do it in my way. I guess
Mhm.
that's how to do it. I think this is something that we, as earlier I mentioned, we are in the era of 3G. I think this is the interesting part about globalization is that we are exposed to the differing mindsets. So now for TCK, we have embraced that lifestyle, whereas for the millennial generation, they have only been able to see it through the medium
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
social media or even any of the gadgets. So as a result, I guess is that for us, we retain tradition of respect, but the way we operate, it doesn't have to be the same way our parents do it. It's because nowadays we can do it in a lot faster, I guess, if you want to call it, because we have better access to technology. So I guess this is something that will be evolving, if you want to call it, or metamorphosis.
No, I agree because every generation has a generational difference throughout history.
Yeah,
Parents always think their kids whatever, and of course I always thought, well, I will never be that because I'll never be that old. I'm always going to keep up. But I watch my grandkids and I think I have no idea actually how it goes for them because they're spending their whole lives on the phone. Do they have any friends? But that's how they make friends. Okay, fine. The problem or the difference with this generation is exactly what you're saying: is the level of communication and technology has exponentially accelerated this. One of the things too, I think it's done. I'm not sure you can tell me because you're in the position of looking forward, but when I grew up, it was kind of like you kind of knew where you were heading. I mean, you're either going to be, if you're a woman, there's certain jobs you're going to do. And I think For the males, there were certain jobs they were going to do, and there were only a certain amount of jobs in the world. Now, when you're looking ahead, one of the things for TCKs that was a problem was if we're growing up outside of our culture, we might not see the kids in a university or the new careers to sort of get that idea of where we needed to go, which was sort of part of the delayed adolescence. But the way the world is changing, the amount of jobs and the kind of jobs and how in the world, I think, how does anybody find these jobs when they don't even know they're out there, and they're in technology, they're in all these goofy things. And there's so many options, but there's also such a rapid change in where you're going to work and how you're going to work. And I think that's got to be a little confusing if I was you, but I'm not you. See, I don't have to think about that, but I think about my grandkids. How are they going to figure out what they're going to do? Because there's so many options and they just keep switching. And like COVID's taught us, none of us know really what stability is, where things are going to go. So you have a great challenge, but I also have great hope. You guys think, you're willing to share your stories, you're willing to help, you're willing to talk to your parents, and I believe you're going to sort it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that too.
Yeah, it's good.
I'm figuring that out.
It's good. It's good.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for having the confidence for my generation. And
No, I'm very encouraged. I think one of the good things is because you can think out of the box. I remember I was at a young CITAR, Society for Intercultural Education, Training, and Research, and they asked me to come there and speak. Okay, but so they were all young. And so they were talking about having an e-conference, or they were going to be trying to keep together, through the year with all this electronic stuff. This is maybe 15, 20 years ago. And I'm thinking, who's got time? How are they ever going to do that? I mean, to me, it was just completely another world. And they did it. I thought, oh, I guess this is the next wave that I'm absolutely unaware of. But, they all got it. And of course, the joke in my generation is whatever we can't figure out, we just ask our grandkids on the phones or on the computers, and they just come and they type 3 things, and then you're fine. So we always just say, ask your grandkids. It's good. We're glad you're smart.
For my dad now, it's still kids. The grandkids is still a baby at the moment. So
okay, so that one can't do it yet. Well,
yeah.
I have.
Well, he actually know how to contact me using his mother's phone without knowing me.
All right.
So he knows how to open the phone. So he just
Starting young.
take the phone and put it on my sister's face. So the
Amazing.
phone was unlocked, and he called
Amazing.
me. And when I answered it, I was like, "Wait, what is this voice?" Then after that, I texted my sister. It's like, "Sis, did you call me?" No, he did. I'm like, "Wait, what?" And he doesn't know my name at that time because he can't read at that time.
Wow.
He just know because in my sister's phone, I'm only written as baby brother or little brother, right? So the fact that he actually found out about it, I'm like, how do you do that? So
But that also says something about the world, isn't it? So he'll never know a world that doesn't have it. I was, I've spoken on those phones that were the kind that were, where everybody could pick up the line and everybody could hear the next person's conversation. I mean, literally, when I was a child, we were up in Minnesota, and they were still using those kind of phones where, you had to get a ring for you, but you didn't know who else picked up just to listen in. And then, of course, we went through the dials and then a touch phone and, all of that. So I'm a living museum by now. But it's really interesting that young children so quickly are doing that. So, the world is changing. And my feeling about the TCK experience, it gave us a running head start on what's going on, so that before it went so universally, we kind of had a little petri dish where we could look at this experience of what is it like to grow up cross-culturally with mobility back and forth between cultures, and look at those effects, because it was being done cross-nationally and cross-culture. I mean, there were people of many different backgrounds who were experiencing the same thing. And so what is it we were experiencing? And we were experiencing identity issues. You know, who are we? That became this big crisis. Well, the world's in a crisis now with identity, but we also experienced the loss. And that was for me the big thing of my story when I was 39 was I'd had this life I really loved, but this other place was there. And so as I started to journal, and I started with my first night in boarding school because I went to boarding school when I was 6. And suddenly I was touching a loss in a deepest level that I had ever known. And that, as I started to journal, I realized that when I left Nigeria at 13, my world died. And I had no word for it. We didn't have a funeral because, you know, there was nobody that died. So I think for me, part of the freedom was not to be afraid of looking at my losses because it didn't mean I didn't have a good life. What it meant was my life was so good, if I lost it, I missed it. And I think actually COVID's put everybody into transition and loss and hidden loss. And for me, the understanding that part of the story, the hidden loss, with the losses you can't see, the things that were a death but weren't a death, like my world, or my parents went back to Nigeria when I was 14. And when I started to write about that, I realized I was crying as if I had gotten a phone call that all 6 of them were killed in a car accident because we never lived together as 6 children and 2 parents again. So when COVID came and I had just moved and we all went into transition like instantly, I could feel that old kind of depression. And I thought, all right, what is this? And I thought, okay, this is grief. This is loss. What are the things I've lost? And to try and work with it in that way. So that's another skill set that I think our story can help us with. How do we translate that skill set to the current situation, to other people? And so that's what I really believe is that if we use our story well, we were given it in time to be prepared for what is becoming a global story.
Okay. Yeah. So I actually have one final question for you, Doc.
Okay.
So, all right, Dr. Ruth. So the last question is this, though. With regards to the third edition, the TCK book now putting the term as an umbrella of cross-culture kit, as you have mentioned earlier, yeah? How do you feel the category will grow from the time from Dr. Ruth Unsin time? Dr. Ruth says that the last time is that with her background as an anthropologist, the category will keep on growing. For yourself, though, how do you see this community grow? How do you think the term TCK will evolve? Because nowadays, as you mentioned before, even when we are live, you already mentioned that there are certain issues that you wouldn't have expected with the upcoming generation, that your grandson or even what my generation has actually been able to present. So how do you think the category will grow? Because nowadays we have a lot more resources, if you want to call it, because there's even an HBO show to actually show a TCK story. There are TCK in the position of prominence, such as former US President Barack Obama, the late Kobe Bryant, and well, you have your book. How do you think the category will grow, though, even with knowledge of the previous generation?
Well, I think that some things are universal. Like I said, the need to belong and grief when we lose, those things are universal. So we kind of have those defined. Now the question is, how are those played out? And what I love about what's going on right now, one of the things when I did the cross-cultural kit or the CCK umbrella was with the hope that people could either look at their tiny experience. If you're from military, you could look at that, but then you look at it within the context of being a TCK. But then if we look at the CCK and we include what's going on in the world, my hope has always been, and this is what I think starting, how do we compare and contrast instead of all of us being in our different circles that, oh, I'm a refugee, well, you can't understand me because your parents were in business, to say what are those places that we share with each other. And that's what I hope will grow. I don't know what the language will become. For me, cross-cultural was easier. Like I said, people were fussing about third culture, and it was hard to explain third culture. And so that kind of simplified it for me. I'm not jealous for that language. If you can figure out a better one, that's fine. But what I see as the topic is realizing that these essential building blocks that we've been talking about for a long time are actually relevant to these other categories. And instead of staying just in our bubble, that we start to have these conversations. So one of them that started for me a few years ago, maybe 6, 7 years ago in Germany, when someone called me and I was there for doing something, and she heard, I don't know, she called, she said, "Can I come talk with you?" She said, "Why didn't you put disabilities in your cross-cultural kid circles?" I said, "Because I never thought about it. Tell me." So she was the hearing child of deaf parents. And she said the deaf culture is a completely different culture. And I have her story in the new book, Oya Ataman. And that just taught me a whole nother thing. I didn't know anything, so she was a Turkish TCK, but she was also had this other piece. So that added something. When I went and did something for people who work with foster kids here in the States, those kids move all the time. They are, and every family is a new culture. So I think when we start to think about what we already learned, you can see the application. And the stories aren't exactly, but this heart thing, this place, how it impacts people. And so we have, I think, instead of guarding our territory, we should be expanding our tents and saying, there's a lot of people in this tent with us. What are our conversations? And we can also learn from the others. We're not just, the ones dispensing, but when I talk to somebody from another place, I think actually it was the hearing child of a deaf person, he said he was the trophy child because he was going to be the child that helped his parents make a connection. Well, then others who were in that group who were from Asia felt, well, wait, I was the trophy child because I learned English. So I was supposed to help my family. So we have so much, but what we need to do is keep talking, conversing, understanding each other's story, and not being terminally unique, not being, that we're the only ones saying, this is our story. It happened this way. But it gives me so much understanding and joy to think of how it connects me to other people instead of how it isolates me.